Chapter 7. The End of Money. A few days later, Alice, while rolling along one of the elevated streets of the city with Ralph, inquires how the present monetary system has been evolved. "You know," she confides, "I know very little of economics." "Well," says Ralph, "all monetary systems of the past or present are based on one principle, the exchange of one thing for another. At first it was simply a bartering or swapping of such things as a goat for a pig or a string of beads for a piece of cloth. Only much later did money evolve. Before we had coins, certain rare shells were used as tokens. Still later, precious metal was exchanged for goods using the weight of the metal as a basis. Later on, coins were developed, and still later on, paper money replaced parts of the coins. Where the shells, the precious metals, and later the metal coins had intrinsic value, the paper money had no such value. The public accepted with faith and confidence a piece of paper across which was printed the guarantee that the bearer of it would receive so many metal dollars in exchange for the piece of paper. The paper money was built upon confidence that the people had in the government issuing the paper money. Very few people ever thought of going to a bank or to the government's treasury to exchange the paper money for gold or silver coins. Instead, they freely circulated this paper money among themselves, and after people became accustomed to it, they accepted the paper money to the practical exclusion of gold and silver. Particularly in the former United States did this system reach a high development, more so than in old Europe, where paper money was used in conjunction with gold or silver coins. In the United States, however, nothing but paper money was eventually used, even to the exclusion of the smallest coins, whereas up to a certain period the dollar bill was the smallest paper money unit used. This was later split up into the former coins of 50 cents, 25 cents, 10 cents, 5 cents, and 1 cent. It was found that small paper bills the size of former postage stamps were not very practical when issued in separate pieces, so the printed tape coins, which we have today, came into extensive use. The small metal box you carry and from which you unroll your printed perforated tape still represents the old paper money. When you therefore make a purchase today and you unroll 50 cents in 10-cent denominations on your perforated roll, you are using a portion of the old system. But the real monetary system is built upon confidence. It could not be otherwise today because we have no more precious metals. Then, about 95 years ago, the Frenchman P865+ finished the transmutation of all the precious metals. The death knell of the old monetary system was sounded. Everybody could make gold and silver for less than iron used to cost in the old days. Consequently, if you had a $100 bill that said on its face that you could exchange it for $100 worth of gold, you could have gone to the treasury and received 5 $20 gold pieces, which, however, was not worth more, perhaps, than 1 or 2 cents. So of what use was the $100 bill? When P865+ made his announcement, it caused neither panic nor confusion. Several centuries prior, there would have been panic, but the world has been progressing in knowledge and understands that the commerce and economics are stabilized by confidence. There is only one thing in this world that has a real value, and that is man's work. You can replace almost everything else with something else, but you cannot replace labor. The modern economic system is therefore reared entirely upon man's work. When the check came into use in the 19th century, the monetary system underwent a great change. Instead of people paying what they owed by means of coins or banknotes, they took to paying each other by means of a written piece of paper, the check. Billions upon billions of dollars and cents changed hands simply by signing a check to someone else. The check cleared through the bank. While one account was credited, another was debited. There was little actual money that changed hands, either between the man who wrote the check or the man who received it, and even between the banks that cleared the checks. In other words, the entire check system was based upon credit. You received a check for $100 from a man who owed you $100. You took this check in good faith because you knew that he must have $100 in the bank, otherwise he probably would not make out the check. You sent the check to your bank, which in turn collected it from the bank in which your debtor had his account. In all these transactions, no real money ever changed hands. It was credit, pure and simple all the way through. So when P865+ demonstrated his synthetic metals, the situation did not change. The people appreciated the fact that the government in one way or another must be good, and that although the money reserves as figured in metal dollars and cents had become valueless, everyone knew that the country was not founded and based upon valueless metals alone. Incidentally, no government the entire world over could have redeemed in gold or silver coin all of its outstanding obligations. Therefore, when gold and silver became practically valueless, nothing happened because actual coins were no longer used, and everyone used checks, so that even banknotes had become obsolete. But with the devaluation of the so-called precious metals, the government substituted other values. This was done at first by setting fixed values on property such as real estate, buildings, manufacturing plants, etc. Valuations of these were made several times a year, and whoever owned such properties was given a state value certificate. A building valued at $50,000 was appraised by the state 3 or 4 times more a year. Certificate was given to you, which you took to your bank, the latter immediately crediting you with a part of the $50,000. If you wanted to sell your property to a friend for $50,000 or more, you would take his check and then demand from your bank the return of the original deed, which in turn would be transferred to your friend. In that case, your bank would credit you with the $50,000 check of your friend while he would have the property. Of course, the illustration which I gave is not exactly accurate for the reason that you could not get from your bank the exact amount of the valuation of whatever reality changed hands. The bank advanced about 70% of the appraised value, with certain exceptions. This also was in no wise different from the way our ancestors were accustomed to do, because in the old days such a transaction would simply have been called a mortgage. The important difference, however, later on was that the valuation was made by the state, and such valuation was final. This tended to stabilize real estate and property values. Merchandise today is bought and sold as the same as it was bought and sold centuries ago, that is, by check. So if everything else, including labor. Every workman is, of course, paid by check, which check he can use either in his own bank account or for buying merchandise from his grocer or tailor, getting the difference in the check or otherwise as fractional paper tape coin. These government tape coins and banknotes, a few things that are being used, instead of being covered by gold and silver bullion, are now covered by real estate bonds or other tangible property. But, Alice asked, suppose there was a panic, as described in some of the ancient books, and everybody ran to the bank at once to get his money. What would happen? Nothing, said Ralph, absolutely nothing. Suppose there was a panic, as you call it, in the first place. Why should there be one? There is no reason for it, and no one nowadays would think of running to the bank and getting his or her money. There is no money, as you call it. Remember, the banks are all under government control, and if a bank should fail, which no bank has done for the last 400 years, the government would be obliged to make good the shortage out of its own resources. If everybody ran simultaneously to every bank throughout the country, a bank would simply make out a check for each total balance and pass out a check for the amount. Then the next morning, as the people could not eat their checks for breakfast, they would have to do one of two things, either take the check back to the bank and redeposit it, or exchange the check for commodities. That means that within 24 hours, all the checks would have found their way back to the banks, and things would be just exactly where they had left off before the run on the bank. As banks are no longer under the necessity of paying in coin or banknotes, but under the law can pay by check, there is no reason why anyone should wish to make a run on the bank simply to get a check. But, Alice persisted, so suppose you draw out more than you have to your credit. Suppose you write out a check for more than you have in the bank. What happens then? You probably can answer that just as well as I can, replied Ralph. To do so is a prison offense, and again it would do you no good, because following the first offense you would get a warning from the government, and at the second such offense you would get a still stronger warning, and on the third you would go to jail, because the first two offenses could perhaps be mistakes, but the third could not. On top of this, your account would be withdrawn from all banks, and you would not be able to open another account again for 10 years, because all checks, as you know, are identified with fingerprints in addition to the signature. The fingerprint experts of the government would prevent you from opening another account in any bank anywhere in the country, so no one abuses his checking privilege and writes out checks when there are no funds to his credit. A few days later, Ralph takes Alice to one of the great industrial artificial cloth works. They fly to Pennsylvania, where the great artificial silk, cotton, and wool mills are located. Ralph explains that during the 20th century, silk has finally been made artificially from wood and chemicals. This was known as artificial silk. But only during the last century has it been possible to manufacture artificial cotton, wool, from wood and other chemicals. Moreover, they wore better than the real cotton and real wool. In the enormous plant were immense tanks in which the raw material are first cooked and then treated by chemicals until the fibers issued in the fine microscopic streams from nozzles under hydraulic pressure. The threads are then wound on huge reels. From here the bulks are sent to the spinneries and cloth weaving mills. Of particular interest is the new kind of cloth, which is much lighter than wool or cotton and at the same time cooler in summer and warmer in winter. This material is made from cork, which was first pulverized and then afterward digested by means of chemicals. Under hydraulic pressure, a somewhat thick thread is obtained, which has all the good properties of cork, but none of the poor ones. This cork thread, when woven into cloth, makes a texture both light and durable, has a velvety touch to the fingers, and being a poor heat conductor, protects the wearer from heat in the summer and cold in the winter. A number of combinations are made whereby cork thread and silk thread are spun together, giving an entirely new product with all the virtues of silk as well as those of cork. Chapter 8. The Menace of the Invisible Cloak. Leaving the Pennsylvania Mills, the Aeroflyer travels at high speed, landing the party within a very short time on one of the tall buildings in New York. Ralph and Alice make their way down to the elevated roadway, where at Ralph's suggestion they put on their power skates, for as he explains smilingly, it is but a short distance to his home, and the exercise will do them both good and give them an appetite for luncheon. When they are but a little way from their destination, Ralph becomes conscious of a faint hissing sound close behind them. Twice he glances over his shoulder, but the roadway at that hour, it is just before noon, is deserted. Yet the sibilant sound persists, seeming to be getting closer and closer, like some persevering insect about to alight. Alice apparently hears nothing, or perhaps she thinks it's merely one of the noises of the street, for she chatters on in the gay, animated fashion that is one of her charms, oblivious to the fact that the man at her side is so preoccupied that he scarcely replies to her. For Ralph has now satisfied himself that there is nothing anywhere around them which can be causing this untiring, pursuant hiss. Then from what secret invisible source does it emanate, and why? To the scientist, accustomed to explaining the unexplainable, it is ominous, menacing. Again he turns to look behind him along the deserted way, and at that moment he hears a stifled cry from the girl beside him. He whirls to face her and faces nothing. He is alone on the empty street. Doubting the evidence of his eyes, he stares about him, too astounded for the moment by this mystifying and amazing disappearance of Alice to think clearly. Above him the sun shines in the dear blue sky. Before and behind him stretches the still roadway. Then he is aware of the silent, deadly quiet, for the hissing has receded into nothingness, and with it Alice. As the full force of the catastrophe strikes him, something akin to panic seizes him. The danger to himself he can have faced with the calm courage of a brave man, but this unseen and unexpected blow from an invisible source aimed at the girl so close and dear to his heart smites him with a chill terror that for an instant holds him powerless in its grip. That he should have been careless when she was in danger, that this was no time for self-reproaches. To act, and to act at once, this is vital. Thoughts of high-frequency radio waves, of X-rays, of Ferdinand. Fernand, he explains aloud, and with the name coherent thought returns. Putting on all possible speed, he covers the distance to his home in a few seconds and dashes up to his laboratory. The while swiftly working brain has attacked the greatest personal problem that has ever been called upon to solve. Having experimented with ultra-short waves, he knows that it is possible to create total transparency of any object if the object can be made to vibrate approximately the same rate as light. He is familiar with the theory, and although he has worked on it at times, he has never seen a practical demonstration of it. He realizes a machine is in the hands of someone intent on kidnapping Alice. He knows, too, that the police description will be flashed within a radius of thousands of miles instantly. It will be necessary for the abductor to keep Alice invisible for some time to come for fear of someone seeing and recognizing her. All this flashes through his mind as he assembles a detecting apparatus consisting of a portable aerial and a small box containing a few radio instruments and a pair of headphones. The aerial, by being rotated, can determine the point from which the waves emanate. In 10 minutes, Ralph has the apparatus legged up and begins rotating the aerial until a roaring noise is heard in the telephones. He knows that this must be the apparatus producing the invisibility, and within a few seconds he is dashed from his house on the power skates, carrying the detector in front of him. 2 of his assistants accompany him. The pursuit is on. As they approach the kidnapper, the sounds in the telephone become stronger. They speed along Broadway, while the hastily notified police keep the way open. The rising sound in the phones clearly indicates that they are heading directly towards the abductor. They gain steadily on him, while the rolling, flying police clear Ralph's way with their shrieking sirens, while the kidnappers have to pick his way slowly through the crowd. The chase leads them into a narrow street on the outskirts of the city. The sound that comes through the telephones is now exceedingly loud, indicating that the quarry is nearby. By this very nearness is confusing to Ralph, for the volume of the sound prevents him from exactly locating the invisible kidnapper and the girl. In vain he turns the aerial in all directions, seeking one point from which it comes louder than another that will determine the course of the pursuit. For the moment he is halted, and like some hound baffled by the cunning of the fox, he casts about him, eagerly waiting for what he knows must come, the next move of the pursued man. And then it comes, a deepening tone in the telephones, a gradation of sound that to the trained ear of the scientist tells him all he wishes to know. With an exultant cry he springs forward and dashes through the entrance of a small store. The proprietor, whose state of mind may be described by the word flabbergasted, struggles for some moments in vain for speech, while Ralph and his men, with outstretched hands, eagerly sweep from wall to wall. "Here, here, you fellows," he finally manages to gasp. "What are you after? What are you trying to do? You'll knock something over there in a minute. Hey, look out there. Oh, there it goes." For Ralph had reached around a tailor's dummy, knocking it over as his hands closed upon something behind it, something invisible and yet warm and firm, something that quivered and shrunk away at his touch. The proprietor, rushing forward to pick up the dummy, stops short, gaping. Ralph's hands at the moment of contact vanish into thin air, but in an instant they reappear as he draws towards him, out of the influence of the ultra-short waves, which he knows must be the bound and gagged form of Alice. Once away from the influence of the apparatus, she becomes visible again. A sack has been tied over her head and shoulders, and her hands are tightly bound to her sides. She is still on her roller skates, and her feet have been left free, the sack being sufficient to render her almost wholly helpless, and unable to make any effective resistance. As Ralph removes the fastenings and releases her, she staggers and clings to him, her head dropping in exhaustion. "Oh," she gasps faintly. "What is it? Where did you go?" "Water," explains Ralph harshly to those about him, and the fat storekeeper, trembling with excitement, but withal displaying an extraordinary energy for one who could never at any time have been a streamline model, made a dive for a vase of flowers on the counter. Grasping the tops of the flowers with one hand, he flings them in a corner, and tendering the vase of discoloured water to Ralph, pants the while as one who has run his race and emerges triumphant. "I said water, not mud," shouts Ralph in exasperation, as he rubs the girl's cold hands between his warm ones. "Well, that's water, ain't it?" says the man, and Ralph glowers at him. "Please," says Alice, trying to withdraw her hands. "I'm all right. Indeed I am. I was just a little dizzy for a minute, but it's all past now." The colour returns to her pale cheeks with a rush, and she straightens herself and turns away in some confusion, her hands instinctively going to her hair, the gesture that women have ever used when at a loss for words. In the meantime, Ralph's two assistants have found the ultra-wave machine by the very simple method of feeling about the spot where the girl has been discovered. When their hands disappear, they know they have it, and Ralph orders some water thrown upon it, which has the twofold result of stopping its activity and of bringing it into view. Having assured himself that Alice is unharmed and recovering from the shock resulting from her misadventure, the scientist makes a minute examination of the instrument. It is a complicated machine and one totally strange to him. As he studies it, he feels a growing conviction that this was no Earth-made machine, but one conceived and made by a Martian. Undoubtedly, it is the work of some master of science, a true mental giant. Then there, he asked himself, did Fernand, if it was Fernand, secure it, and how? His object, of course, was obvious. He was evidently prepared to go to any lengths to secure the girl for himself. Had he not so threatened her? His method of attack had been ingenious, fiendishly ingenious. Here was no mean antagonist, no petty enemy, but one whose cunning would tax Ralph's resourcefulness to the utmost. When he finally turns away from his inspection, he finds Alice quite herself again. She is listening to the store proprietor's version of the affair, a story that under the stimulus of Alice's dark eyes loses none in the telling, for where facts fail him, imagination does not. "Flew open before my very eyes," he was saying when Ralph turns around, "as if by unseen hands, and then this terrible sound, I can't scarcely describe it, more like a great machine than anything else. I says to myself, says I, there's something strange about this, I says. I'd better be on the lookout. I might be needed, for it looks to me as though someone was up to something." As a matter of fact, he had thought the opening of the door due to the passing wind, and the hissing of the machine, which has already been likened to the buzz of an insect, the humming of a bee, let in by the same agency. "And then that black man, he gave me a fright." "What about him? What was he like?" asked Ralph. "Ah," the proprietor swells with importance, "that's just what I've been asking myself. Strange we should hit on the same thoughts, ain't it?" "Very," commented the scientist with wasted irony. "Can't you give any description of him? When and how did you see him, anyway?" The proprietor put his hands in his pockets and swayed back and forth on the balls of his feet. He surveyed each member of his little audience with glances of poignant meaning, as one who has much of consequence to tell, all in good time. Finally he speaks. "He was black. Black all over." "Yes, yes," explains Ralph impatiently. "You told us that before. Can't you give us something definite to go by? His face, for instance. What was it like?" The other leaned forward and taps him on the chest impressively. "Aye, that was black too. Black," he cried. Black it was, all covered with black cloth. The none too intelligent storekeeper smugly says, "He came right out of the air before my eyes, all black, with black cloth on his face, rolled out of my store like a cyclone." "You should have tried to hold him," says Ralph. "Well, I gave him a look. I can tell you he won't forget in a hurry. I just stood there and looked at him, like this." He screws up his face in so alarming a manner that one of Ralph's assistants is moved to remark that it is a wonder he didn't drop dead with a face like that. "What do you mean?" demands the owner of the countenance in question. "I said," repeated the assistant, "it was a wonder he didn't drop dead. I would have. It's all I can do to look at you right now." Alice, unable to control her laughter any longer, hastily murmurs something about fresh air and goes to the door. Ralph, keeping his own face straight by a valiant effort, orders his men to lift the ultra-ray machine and take it back to the lab to give it a more minute inspection at his leisure. The girl and the man are very silent on their way back to Ralph's home. A tragedy has been narrowly averted, and each felt that this first attempt might be no means the last. Only once does Alice voice her fears. "You know," she says, "I'm certain it was Fernand." She hesitates for a brief moment, and then holds out her hand. In the palm lay a small heart-shaped object of a curious translucent green, delicately carved. It is pierced for a chain, and indeed a part of the chain still hangs there, but it has been broken off short, and only a few links remain. "What's that?" asks Ralph. "A charm that Fernand always carries. He shows it to me once. He's very superstitious about it, he tells me, and I found it back there in the store when I went to the door." Ralph looks very thoughtful. "Then he must have brought the machine from Mars. And with such resources at his command, I wonder what his next move will be." End of chapter 8.